Good evening and welcome to The Book Show. Great show tonight. We've got special guest Graeme Lay, who'll be a delight. But let me introduce my co-host, John Reynolds. John, nice to see you.
Always a pleasure to be here, Neville.
And how are you?
I'm well, yes. Been busily reading. Books are flooding in from people who are interested in having their books on the book show, which is very gratifying.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. But you're going to tell us about the World Book News.
Well, the World Book News, going to the world first of all, and then I'll come much closer to home. We've talked, I think I gave some statistics last time about the rise in books and library attendance and all the rest of it, and that's very commendable. But it's also interesting to note that e-books, the sales are rocketing. That in America, they've gone up 63%, up to 121.5 million books were sold last year as e-books, whereas print books, which some people are now calling P-books, God help us, P-books, 711 million. So that's 711 million compared with to 121 million. But when you look at how new e-books are, it's astonishing how they've taken off.
And is that at the expense of P-books?
Well, the other argument, if you take last week, I think it was, statistics, people are reading more. So maybe people are doing both.
Indeed.
What about yourself? Do you have e-books or do you read?
I don't. Although I gave it a try. I was astounded. I was an instant convert, but I love the feel of books.
Yes.
But then you'll recall, we had a guest who said, why not do both? Why not get the weight and feel of a book when you're reading it, but when you go to bed, take your e-book because it's easier.
Yes, my wife has an e-book. She
Yeah.
swears by it. She's a voracious reader. The house is stacked with books, but she's just totally in love with her e-book because, it's, as you say, it's so easy to pick it up and read it. And a lot of authors are now realizing you can, as a publisher, as an author, you can do both. You can have the hard copy and you can also release it as an e-book, because once you've done the work and got the manuscript, then there you go.
Yes. And I spoke to a publisher the other day who now has that as part of strategy. So first the print edition, then the e-book, and the timing, at least according to her, was quite important, so that you make sales in both.
Yes, yes. So there we go. So that's the e-book. And I don't see it. It's a bit like radio and television. Television didn't signal the end of radio. Radio adapted, and they sit side by side.
Yes.
In the meantime, of course, that's changing as well. But let's not predict too much in that area. I've had a lot of information from various areas, and this one from the Wairarapa. It's all happening down in the Wairarapa. They have a spoken word event. We'll put this on the screen later on, but just a nice little poster there. And they're looking at encouraging local writers. And what's happening is that on the first day of the month, every month, in Carterton, at a bookshop there, Almos Books, A-L-M-O-S, give them a plug because they're supporting local writers. They have a small publication which features 16 Wairarapa-based writers, will be released with 16 poems. Each poet will arrange for the publication to be at a venue in their town, and the publication will be donated to the 48 primary secondary schools in the Wairarapa and the 8 libraries. So I think it's a wonderful way of involving local writers and involving them in the schools as well.
Yes. We should go.
We should.
And incorporate a glass of Martin Borough, something
Yes,
or
that
other.
would be nice, wouldn't it? Okay, so there we are. That's the Wairarapa word. So thanks to those people for sending that in, and please keep your ideas coming in, because we're always interested in featuring local writers on the book show. So we now have to hand the Nielsen Weekly Bestsellers list for New Zealand books, New Zealand fiction. At the top, Witi Ihimara with White Liars. I believe that's a movie. Haven't seen it yet, but it's on locally. Then Black Peak Station. I think I mentioned that about 3 weeks ago on one of the earlier shows.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Holly Ford. Then The Writing Class, Stephanie Johnson. And then this week, we're featuring Graeme Lay as our guest, and he's currently at number 4.
Excellent.
The Secret Life of James Cook. And just to show how current we are on the book show, a couple of weeks ago we had Judith White, The Elusive Language of Ducks, and she's sitting at number 5. So there you go. So at number 6, Only the Dead, Ben Saunders. Cross Fingers, Paddy Richardson. Ian Wedding, it's poems. I think the main one is called The Lifeguard, or that's the title of the book. And then we have The Conductor, Sarah Quigley. Tama, Children of War. That's a trilogy by Deborah Challenor. So it's at number 10. Top in non-fiction, and we'll come back to that at another show, is Roar by Martin Crowe. So keeping a straight bat, I would imagine, or on a sticky wicket or something.
Yes.
So that's World Book News.
All right. Thank you very much, John. Okay. And thank you. We'll be back right after the break with our special guest, Graeme Lay, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.
If the book you are reading late at night is not helping you sleep, maybe it's time for Sleep by Remy Fairman. This natural product helps you to have a normal and healthy sleep. It calms a racing mind and helps with anxiety. Suitable for men and women. Wake up refreshed and able to remember the story. Available from leading pharmacies and health stores.
Welcome back to the Book Show, and it's a great welcome to my special guest this evening, Graeme Lay. Graeme, welcome.
Thank you.
How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Yep.
And we might sort of try and discover, who are you? Graeme Lay. So you're a man of books. You're editor, prolific writer. You make a living as a writer, short stories, articles, magazines, books editor for North and South, I remember.
Former books editor.
Former books editor.
Yes.
But how would you describe Graeme Lay in a nutshell?
Well, I'm a full-time writer. You know, it's my job. It's I get up in the morning and have a shower and shave, and then I go into my office, which is in my lounge at home.
Yep.
I don't have to commute. I don't have to get stuck on the motorway, and I sit down in front of my PC and keyboard's operating, and away I go.
All right.
People tend to kind of romanticize writing a bit, but it is just like an office job. A bit more demanding in some ways, but it's. I've been a full-time writer now for about 17 years, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It's a marvellous way to make a living. It's not well paid, I have to say, but I'm my own boss and I make my own decisions, and I'm not answerable to anyone initially.
Yeah.
Later, I'm answerable to publishers and editors and all the rest of it. But I'm self-employed, and that's the way I like it.
All right.
So I describe myself as a writer.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's what you put on the card at the airport.
That's right.
Writer.
Yes.
Yeah.
And sometimes they give me very strange looks when I do
Yeah.
that. So, writer? We don't have writers in New Zealand, do we?
All right. And so a couple of quick questions about that. Are you one of those people that says 2,000 words a day, come what may?
Not as rigid as that.
Yeah.
I do set myself a quota, but it's more in terms of the episode that I want to write, which fits in with the rest of the story. So you can't sort of limit that to, say, 2,500 words or 1,800 words. It's just sufficient words to meet the necessity of what you're writing about.
Right.
So it's an episodic thing, really, especially when you're writing a novel. And in the case of the James Cook novel, very episodic, because he was moving from one place to another and so on. And there are large bits of boredom in between when they were at sea and nothing much was happening except gales and blizzards and rough waves striking the ship and all that stuff. And you don't want to keep repeating that all the time.
Yes. Yeah.
But that was the reality of it.
Yeah. And in terms of that episodic bit, in relation to you as the writer, are you one of those people that does all the research up front, or do you do it in passages?
I tend to do it as I'm going along, but naturally there's quite a lot of background reading to do before you start. But the great thing about being a writer, particularly an imaginative writer, is that you can write a lot of it in your head. So that I find it really helpful when I'm mowing the lawns.
Yes.
I put the earmuffs on, blocking out as much sound as I can.
Yep.
That things are moving in your imagination. I've had women say they do the same thing when they're doing the ironing. Female writers do. And so it's a question of working it all out in your head first, and then when you sit down in front of the keyboard, then you're just committing what's already there, and you hope it works. Doesn't always work.
And so have you always been a writer?
I've always loved writing,
Yeah.
and that goes right back to my time at school. I can remember the first thing I had published was in the school magazine, and that gave me a bit of a thrill. And off and on, I've been writing pretty much since I was 13, 14.
All right.
But naturally, only a professional writer for the last 17 years or so.
Yes. Well, let me just take the liberty of reading you something that you already know, because I think your introduction to the book sets it up beautifully. The year is 1745. 16-year-old James Cook leaves his parents and siblings in their inland Yorkshire village and walks 20 miles to a coastal town to begin an apprenticeship as a grocer's assistant. There, for the first time, he sees the sea and falls in love, events which dramatically alter the course of his life and the course of world history. And then it moves forward. The year is 1771. 43-year-old Lieutenant James Cook Aryan, recently returned from a circumnavigation of the world, is presented to King George III at St James Palace, London. A national hero now, the one-time village farm boy has proved himself the greatest seaman the world has known. And somewhere between those two paragraphs is the story that's in this book.
That's right. The transformation was remarkable. I mean, who would have picked a boy from a farm Biggin in North Yorkshire, illiterate family, to have risen to the heights that he did? I mean, it is an extraordinary story, an extraordinary life. And as I said, the only way I could think of to make any kind of sense and insight into his personality was to write the story in fiction.
Yes. And so what brought you to James Cook in the first place?
Well, I'd done a lot of travel around the Pacific, South Pacific islands, and I'd been to a lot of the places where that were important to Cook on first, second and third voyages. You know, places in Tonga and in Tahiti and Niue and so on. And I was curious about that aspect, the places that he went to, some of which are very significant historical sites now. The place where he went on Tongatapu is quite a big tourist attraction now. There's little craft stalls and food stalls there. This is where James Cook came ashore. And in Point Venus in Tahiti, it's a park, it's a reserve, it's a picnic ground, and there are monuments and memorials, a very significant part of the Pacific. So all that was the sort of background to it. But then I was asked, I wasn't asked, I decided to write this book, which was a celebration of the artists and writers who came to the Pacific in the early days, in colonial times and pre-colonial times. And I read a lot of their journals and accounts of their discoveries, and I became very, very interested because there were two people who stood out, particularly with the history of Tahiti, and that was James Cook and Joseph Banks. And I read both their journals, a very different style of writing. And then I was asked to write a book about the South Pacific which gave the indigenous people's opinion of these alien people who are coming into their world. And I started to write that, and then I thought, no, this has been done before, you know. It's been done by Anne Salmon and Jamie Bellach. This is not new material. And I thought, again, it occurred to me that I could write it as a novel. Why not do it as a novel? Because strangely enough, no one had done that before. So in the course of writing this book, I discovered quite a lot about Cook's life, his real life, and Joseph Banks. Now, it was always understood that Banks and Cook got on very well in the endeavour. Most records say that they became friends and so on. But the more I read about them, the more unlikely that seemed, because they were such hugely different men, particularly their background. Here was Joseph Banks, rich, privileged, didn't have to work, inherited a lot of money. He was a sort of what we'd call today a playboy, had been to university, been to Oxford, and went to Eton, the great public school, all that. Cook, parents were illiterate, father was a farm labourer, born into a cottage in North Yorkshire, only accidentally received an education, the only member of the family that did. And I thought, these two men were so hugely different in their background and personality. And then the what if factor comes in, you see, you see, Neville. What if they hadn't got on well? What if they quarrelled? And that, I decided, would be one of the strands running through the thing.
And there's a wonderful moment, you just remind me, a wonderful moment in the book where he sends the squid out. So he says to Banks, I will not have you in the great room with your specimens, and has to rise up and remind Banks that I am the commander of this ship, and Banks responds that I am paying for this expedition.
Yes. So they both had a sort of hold over each other.
Yes.
Banks put £10,000 into the voyage, which was a colossal sum of money in those days. So he felt a certain amount of entitlement, but he was still under Cook's command. Cook was in charge of the ship. And yet Banks, because he was a civilian, he wasn't susceptible to naval discipline.
Right.
So there's a strange grey area in between.
Yeah.
So right through the story of the Endeavour voyage, there's this kind of resentment on both their parts, that Cook trying to make Banks toe the line, and Banks knowing full well that he's got a hold over Cook because he's paying for the voyage, you know. It's an extraordinary thing.
I was astounded reading the book that there's so much, even in the factual parts. We all think we know something about Cook, but there's a whole lot that I figure we don't know. And I just wondered what was the most surprising stuff that you discovered in your research?
The most surprising thing was that he was largely self-educated. He learned to sail ships in Whitby, out of Whitby and on colliers, and he went to navigation school in Whitby. The Walker brothers ran a navigation school there. But the astronomical stuff and the hydrography was largely self-taught. And he drew magnificent coastlines, charted magnificent coastlines. Some of those charts were still being used until the 1950s and 60s, the ones in Newfoundland and the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. So all that was largely self-taught, which shows that he was driven to succeed. And he must have had a ferocious intelligence, no doubt about that, to be able to absorb all this material and then to be able to apply it to the great circumnavigations that went on. Yeah, that was the most surprising thing to me.
All right. And again, there's that part of that exchange as well is about your money versus what you describe as if it wasn't for my obsession with that stuff, we wouldn't know where we were.
I think at one stage Cook says if Banks had been in charge of the ship, they never would have got out of Plymouth Sound. He knew nothing about sailing. But he was a dedicated botanist and a great collector of specimens himself. You know, he was a formidable person, I think. Yeah. And
well, so was Cook.
Yes.
So the other thing is, the voice that you have for James Cook fits the character beautifully, I think, and I wondered where you found that.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear you say that, because I had to try to drop little hints of his Yorkshire accent. He would have had a very broad accent, which made him stand out in London circles. You know, he spoke very differently. Banks, of course, would have had a London accent. So, but I didn't want to replicate a Yorkshire accent because it often looks very silly on the page. You know? So I just sort of dropped in little bits here and there and hoped that it's convincing.
Well, I think it's extraordinary. So thank you. There's a touch. There's a significant part of the factual. There is the framework that you put in the fictional character, and there's a touch of the swashbuckling in there for those who like a bit of romance at sea.
It's a great story. I mean, the story of Cook going around the world is something I think unique. You know, he undoubtedly was a great navigator. And the second voyage was even more exciting. That's the one I'm working on at the moment.
The Secret Life of James Cook. Graeme Lay.
Thank
you so much for being with us today. And thank you. And we'll be back right after this break.
If the book you are reading late at night is not helping you sleep, maybe it's time for Sleep by Remy Fairman. This natural product helps you to have a normal and healthy sleep. It calms a racing mind and helps with anxiety. Suitable for men and women. Wake up refreshed and able to remember the story. Available from leading pharmacies and health stores.
Welcome back to the book show, folks. And Graeme Lay, interesting man, isn't he?
He is. And he's written fiction and non-fiction. He makes his living as a writer, which is not easy in New Zealand. So he's a very pleasant guy to talk to, as you can see from the interview.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And he lives
in Devonport, just down the road from where I live in Bayswater.
Must be a good man.
Oh, must be a good man.
All right. Yes. And so, John, Book of the Week.
The Book of the Week is by Lisa Liggett. She's from Dargaville. She's married to a dairy farmer. She has 2 young children, and she describes herself as a full-time Home Executive. A fairly small book this time, and a local book. We've sometimes looked at books that are bestsellers and so on. And it's a self-help book. Now, normally I go, self-help books, because they're full of cliches. But Lisa's intrigued me because she was writing about love affairs or relationships in love. And she starts off with the story of the frog prince and the princess who was supposed to kiss the frog, and the frog would turn into a prince. And so the cover I thought was a very good cover. But she wrote me a letter to cover the book, or to accompany the book, and she said that booksellers found the cover misleading. They thought it was a romance novel, such as a Mills and Boon or a kid's book. So she's thinking of redesigning the cover, or in fact she has a new cover, I think. But I rather like the cover.
Yes.
With the out-of-focus prince looking at the princess while she's thinking about kissing the frog. She bases it on her own relationship. Apparently her first relationship was with a man that she pursued, but he wasn't really that interested in her at all. And so she, rather than starting off talking about that, she talks about the frog and the frog prince. I'll just read you a little bit of the preface. If you are like most girls or women, you will have, or have had, the fairy tale dream that one day Prince Charming will gallop into your life, sweep you off your feet, and treat you like a princess. Sounds nice, doesn't it? You will then live happily ever after in relationship bliss. Sickly, I know, especially if you've experienced Mr. Wrong. When my heart was shattered by the retreating form of the man I loved, I was left with the searing question, how was I going to avoid repeating the experience? So it's based on experience, but rather than then going into a whole lot of stuff about her relationship, she talks about the princess and the frog, and begins it like a fairy tale. A gorgeous but lonely princess sat on her castle balcony, wistfully looking over the roaming hills, hoping to catch a glimpse of her Prince Charming. As the years went by, other princes were being whisked away amidst thundering hooves, holding on tightly to their handsome hunks. In desperation, one day she hoisted up her skirts, marched down the stairs, and declared to her bewildered parents, if he won't come to me, I'll go to him. So with her carriage and a few servants, off she sets, and she meets a frog, and he can talk. But he's not that interested in her, except that he likes to chat to her. So she sat down and spent a lot of time with him. The more time the princess spent with the frog, the more infatuated she became. He was so interesting to talk to, and so deep. She was constantly amazed at all the things they had in common. It was truly as though she had found her soulmate. She was also thankful that she had brought a huge amount of food and clothing with her in her carriage. So there we go. And then she goes on at some length about the relationship with the frog and the prince and the princess. But in the end, the frog is not interested, even though she does everything for him. And this apparently is similar to the first relationship that she had with her, the first love of her life. So there you go. I'll continue a bit more, but this is unrequited love. Ever happened to you, Neville?
Unrequited love.
Unrequited love.
Yes, it has.
Yes.
Yes.
I don't think anybody who hasn't had unrequited love really knows about life. It's a great learning curve, isn't it?
It's a painful learning curve.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Lisa decided that she would write about it, but I like the way she's used this famous sort of adaptation of a fairy tale to talk about her love life. She finally marries a prince, but then she, the princess this is, then goes off partying. And he thought she'd stay at home and be a nice, obedient wife. But night after night, the prince was left alone, playing chess with the servants, while his new bride was gallivanting out with neighbouring royalty. His dream of his beautiful wife at home every minute of his existence, apart from sewing parties during the day with other good wives, was dashed. His hopes for the marriage were a mirage. He was ready for an ultimatum. Then she goes on and talks about her own life and her own background and her first relationship with a guy called Tim. I'm assuming it is Tim, although she may have changed the name, because he doesn't come off very well. But talking about her relationship with Tim, not only was he ambiguous in the way he treated me, but I could never predict when I would see him. His aloofness and unavailability on the weekends only added to the challenge of the chase. His unpredictability meant I was always ecstatic and exhilarated when he did want to spend time with me, but inconsolable when he didn't. So she was always pursuing him. He took her for granted, which we often hear as a complaint. You take me for granted, male and female to male, etc., etc. And that certainly happened to her.
And to be fair, I've known men who'd played those games as well.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
And women?
And women?
Well,
I've never known, really.
Oh, you've never known? Okay.
Whether they're playing a game or not.
Well, that is the whole
as
thing
I
about
plaintively
relationship.
pursue them.
Yes. Yes, indeed. She finally discovered, or she finally came to a self-realization that it was her personality and that she had to develop far more faith in herself and an ability to value her own self-worth, because she felt, a bit like the princess who was pursuing the frog, that everything the frog did was the way things should be. When she finally married her husband, she actually behaved briefly like the princess did when she married the prince. She went off partying until he started to complain, and she realized that wasn't going to work. And so, again, this was another turning point in her relationship.
So the message is, and it's a good one, I think, is about self-realization and,
Yes.
and being true to yourself.
Being true to yourself, but at the same time, and she has 10 strategies, she talks about them at some length. I'll quickly run through them. Be authentic. Face your fear of rejection. Can you handle the rejection? Talk at the right level. Involve people in your life. Go where there are lots of people. Get to know the popular people, because if you get to know the popular people, then you'll move, your circle of friends will widen. Be friendly. Be open about needing friends. Don't expect everyone to become your close friend, and don't ignore problems. Face them. A lot of that is sensible, but I just like the way she went ahead and drew parallels with her own life.
Yes.
And used the analogy of the prince.
And so
the
these are
princess and the frog.
juxtaposed,
Yes.
the prince and the frog and
Yes.
her life.
And her life.
And the 10 points she makes, you may recall we had Terry Williams on the show, and,
Yes.
and much of what he was saying about living a long life, having tested it, was about being with people
Yes.
and
Yes.
confronting the issues that
Yes.
are yours to confront.
Right. And I guess the other thing, and it's interesting about Lisa, because you can see it's a relatively small book. She's printed it herself, which is becoming increasingly popular with people. Self-publishing used to be called vanity publishing, when no one would ever read the book, so you printed off a whole lot. You could say, here's my book. Well, now it's becoming much cheaper, and of course, although she doesn't say so, it's the sort of thing you could release as an e-book without being hideously expensive.
Yes.
She now lives, I'm happy to say, she now lives in Dargaville. She has 2 children, and she's writing a book about motherhood.
Right.
So, Lisa Leggett, living the fairy tale.
Right. In Dargaville, by those wonderful Kaiiwi lakes.
Yes.
Yes.
In the Northern Wairoa. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. John, thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Indeed. And thank you, folks. What a great show. I've enjoyed being here, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Until then, good reading.